Government, even in its very best state, is still evil. Thomas Paine didn't pull any punches in Common Sense, first published January 10th, 1776, and one of the most important pamphlets in American history. It wasn't just a rousing call for independence from the British, it was also an uncompromising and scathing attack on unlimited centralized power. So today on this episode, we're going to dive into some of Thomas Paine's top principles from Common Sense, and I think after hearing a few of them, you'll agree with me that his message is just as relevant and important today as it was more than 2 centuries ago at the beginning stages of the War for Independence. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome, and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, January 10th, 2025. Let's kick it off with just a little background info here from Patrick J. Kiger over at History.com. He points out that even after armed hostilities broke out between the American colonists and British forces in 1775, of course, he's referencing the shot heard round the world, Lexington and Concord of April 75. He writes, many prominent colonists still seemed reluctant to consider the idea of actually breaking away from Britain and instead insisted that they were still its loyal subjects. A lot of people wanted reconciliation. They still wanted to stay part of the empire. But, he writes, a single 47-page pamphlet, the 18th century equivalent of a paperback book or maybe a handbook, did a lot to quickly change that and shift American sentiment towards independence. I've seen some people go so far as to say that sentiment may not have gotten there without Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Here's Robert McDonald over at Teaching American History. He points out that what had until recently been unspeakable and even unthinkable, Paine put it in print. The pamphlet, which gained a massive audience, made a major contribution to the cause of independence. And Kiger over at History.com said the author also made an equally eloquent argument that Americans had a unique opportunity to change the course of history by creating a new sort of government in which people were free and had the power to rule themselves. Here's how Paine actually put it. He said, we have every opportunity and every encouragement before us to form the noblest, purest constitution on the face of the earth. He said, we have it in our power to begin the world over again. And this was a huge, huge seller. Jason Mandris over at Founder of the Day points out it was a powerful argument which people read throughout America. Its popularity was helped by being written in plain English, as opposed to the formal style which was customary at the time. Paine was very readable. He wrote to the common man with common sense. And Jason says, Common Sense sold 100,000 copies in 1 month. I've seen other people cite other numbers like 3 months or less or more. But here's how Jason puts it. For comparison, that would be like selling 6 million copies today in 1 month. And whether or not that's the right number or the wrong number, it sold a lot. It was highly influential. It was more widely read than anything at that point. And here from, this is over at Teaching American History, Ray Tyler, a blog post over there. Regardless of the exact number, Common Sense enjoyed enormous popularity. Those who could not buy the book borrowed copies from friends or neighbors. Illiterate Americans actually heard it read aloud. So this was a very, very, very widely read and widely understood tract. Here, his first sentence, the very first sentence of Common Sense, January 10th, 1776, perfectly describes the source of many of the problems we still face today. He said, some writers have so confounded society with government as to leave little or no distinction between them, whereas they are not only different, but have different origins. Society is not the same thing as government, and vice versa. And I put it like this in an article a couple of years ago. Think about that. Every issue, every problem, pretty much everything in existence, rather than leave it to society to solve, rather than leave it to the market to handle, millions and millions of people believe that the only solution is to run to government. And the fact that government actually caused most of our problems we face today in the first place, this kind of mentality, confounding society with government, as Paine noted in his day, just keeps making things worse and worse and worse. And Paine took things even further in his second paragraph. He said, society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable one. So the best that you get is maybe some form of an evil. And in the worst state, something that you can't tolerate at all. He did not pull any punches at all. And he continued, for when we suffer or are exposed to the same miseries by a government, which we might expect in a country without government, if you think of the notion that they looked at government as a protector of rights, and if you didn't have the government there to protect rights, everything was supposed to be terrible. And he's pointing out, look, things are terrible with that government, that supposed protector. He said, our calamity is heightened by reflecting that we furnish the means by which we suffer. By paying for the system that oppresses you, you are actually furnishing the means by which tyranny can reign. And then from there, Paine actually takes us to the heart of why unlimited, centralized power, embodied basically here in the British monarchy, the king and parliament as well, it poses such a great threat to both life and liberty. He said, in short, monarchy and succession have laid, not in this or that kingdom only, but the world in blood and ashes. 'Tis a form of government which the word of God bears testimony against, and blood will attend it. And he also warned that it was in the nature of this kind of power that it would lead to all kinds of corruption and abuse. And all we have to do is look through history and understand that. And maybe today some people say, well, we get to choose our leaders instead of hereditary succession. And somehow that's going to make it all better. But really, the issue is the amount of power they have. As long as they think that they are just basically unstoppable, they're going to do whatever they want. And here's how Paine put it. Men who look upon themselves born to reign and others to obey soon grow insolent. Selected from the rest of mankind, their minds are early poisoned by importance. And the world they act in differs so materially from the world at large that they have but little opportunity of knowing its true interests. And when they succeed to the government, are frequently the most ignorant and unfit of any throughout the dominions. And again, I know we're not talking about a hereditary monarchy here, but there certainly are people, these kind of elite class of people, parts of the deep state, we could call it, who really have this attitude that they are there to tell us what we need. They have this attitude that they know better than all of us. And the people just need to be kind of controlled and protected from themselves. And I think this sounds very, very familiar to what we live under the largest government in history once again. Now, going back to this idea of reconciliation, the idea that some people didn't think that independence was the right thing, this idea that reconciliation with a government of unlimited power, Paine is basically telling us that it's a trap. And this is how I put it in my article. He rejected the idea of reconciling with Great Britain, stating, quote, that the present tempting offer of reconciliation is a snare. Paine believed that reconciliation would lead to the ruin of the continent and cited several reasons for this belief. I'll get to those in just a moment, but I think it's first important to point out that Paine, just less than a year earlier, was on board with reconciliation. And he put it like this in Common Sense as well. He said, no man was a warmer, that's funny how he writes that. No man was a warmer wisher for a reconciliation than myself before the fatal 19th of April, 1775. So again, there is no reconciliation with an unlimited power that sends people to do a gun-grabbing mission, gun control operation, and start shooting at you. He said, but the moment the event of that day was made known, I rejected the hardened, sullen-tempered Pharaoh of England forever. Now, Paine continued. He did address, as I mentioned, he addressed a number of reasons why reconciliation needed to be rejected in favor of independence, and a lot of the excuses or the claims that some people were making. And first, of course, there is no such thing as reconciliation with unlimited power. For those of you who watched my episode on the American Crisis #1, basically his follow-up essay in December of 1776, he made it very clear. These are the times that try men's souls. He said, we can't. There is no reconciliation, I'm paraphrasing, with a government that claims power over us in all cases whatsoever. That is a reference, a tip of the hat, to the Declaratory Act of 1766, which, well, it established in law that the British Parliament could legislate for anything and everything, no matter what, in all situations for all time. He's like, such a power only belongs to God. No one can have this power. How are we supposed to reconcile with people like this? And he didn't get into that detail in Common Sense, but he certainly really spent a lot of ink railing on the unlimited power of the monarchy. And then he points out here, he said, first, the powers of governing still remaining in the hands of the king, he will have a negative over the whole legislation of this continent. So one dude, thousands of miles away, who couldn't even get information on anything for however long it took to cross the ocean, I don't know, months sometimes, and he would have a say based on something in writing. Well, no, you're not allowed to pass this. He had a veto power over everything in the colonies in all situations for all time. And Paine thinks this is absurd. He was right. And Paine points out, as he hath shown himself such an inveterate enemy to liberty, and discovered such a thirst for arbitrary power. Arbitrary power is power without right, power exercised beyond the limits of a constitution. Even the unwritten British Constitution had some types of limits, mostly through tradition and things like that. And that's why the founding generation, and Paine, as we'll see here in a moment, wanted to have a written constitution, very clear lines in the sand. And he said, is he or is he not a proper person to say to these colonies, you shall make no laws but what I please? It's absurd to think that one person can have such a power over anyone else. And as I'm going through this, I'm citing a number of other articles along with Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which I do urge you to read at least once a year. We can read through this stuff over and over and over again. Once a year becomes a great habit to pick up and understand and learn from these principles. But that will be linked to in the show notes. Alan Mosley organizes a blog post for every episode of the Path to Liberty podcast. And in it, he not only includes all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream video platforms like YouTube and X and LinkedIn and Twitch and Facebook. But we also live stream over at rumble.com, odyssey.com, and everywhere we can actually get the live stream to. If we're missing from something, please do let us know, because we want to expand and be where you prefer us to be. We also have the audio-only podcast edition on all the usual suspects. But he has a show links section in every blog post, kind of in the order as I go through it in the episode. That way, because I'm just kind of scratching the surface with these main principles, you can read and learn more in context on your own time. So Alan will get that organized, and I will get it published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty a couple of hours after this live stream is done. Now, let's get back to some of the objections that Paine was responding to. Objections to independence over reconciliation. Some people were saying things like, well, hey, we're really prosperous. We're growing rich here. And why would we want to kind of break that down and start from scratch? This is a real problem. And Paine said, nah, hold on. This is absurd. We're rich, not because of them, but in spite of what they've been doing. He said, nothing can be more fallacious than this kind of argument. We may as well assert that because a child has thrived upon milk, that it is never to have meat, or that the first 20 years of our lives is to become a precedent for the next 20. So first of all, maybe he's even acknowledging that maybe at first the British got things rolling. But since then, we've grown up. We've grown up and we don't need them anymore. He said, America, and he said, even this is admitting more than is true. For I answer roundly that America would have flourished as much, and probably much more, had no European power taken any notice of her. The commerce by which she hath enriched herself are the necessaries of life, and will always have a market while eating is the custom of Europe. So he's basically saying, like, look, we're not becoming richer and more prosperous because of all this stuff that the British was doing. We're actually becoming rich in spite of that, because he understood, just like so many others, Thomas Jefferson and others, that, well, here's how I put it in my article. We can certainly say the same of today. Government regulations have held things back in serious ways. America, the United States of America, is the richest, most powerful country on the face of the earth. And we do have great opportunity here. But it's not because of the government. Government is actually holding us back. Things would be much, much better without them. And while America, I wrote, has indeed been prosperous, it won't last forever. More importantly, many things likely would have been better without government in the way in the first place. Anyway, so Paine continued. He responded to the claim that somehow the empire was also keeping America safe. Paine, this is always the thing that they want to scare us. Fear, as John Adams put it when he was one of the good guys, the Atlas of Independence in 1775, fear is the foundation of government power, of most governments, is how he put it. I would just remove the word most. But when people are afraid, they look to government to protect them. Unfortunately, the government is the one that we should really be afraid of in most situations. And Paine addressed this as well. We have boasted the protection of Great Britain without considering that her motive was interest and not attachment. She wasn't protecting us or offering us this out of the goodness of her heart, but because she could get something out of it. The more she protected us, the more she could institute her regulations and rules or navigation acts, for example, and then she would benefit out of it. And Paine continued, and that she did not protect us from our enemies on our account, but from her enemies on her own account, from those who had no quarrel with us on any other account, and who will always be our enemies on the same account. TLDR, she wasn't protecting us for the sake of protecting us. We didn't even have enemies unless it was because of our association with her and her policies. So he continued, he said, let Britain waive her pretensions to the continent, or the continent throw off the dependence, and we should be at peace with France and Spain. Were they at war with Britain? And of course, he continues. He points out that I actually think it's really interesting that Thomas Paine was basically in favor of a foreign policy of peace, trade, commerce, no entangling alliances. This is something that those of us who study history of the founding generation, the old revolutionaries, we generally point to people like President George Washington and Thomas Jefferson of leading this kind of message out there. But if you go back a few years, it's actually Thomas Paine making this kind of view really, really popular. First, Paine pointed out that one of the main principles of the American Revolution was free trade. He said, our plan is commerce, and that well attended to will secure us the peace and friendship of all Europe, because it is the interest of all Europe to have America as a free port. Her trade will always be a protection, and her barrenness of gold and silver secure her from invaders. Now, of course, this was a total rejection of the British system of mercantilism. I mentioned the Navigation Acts going all the way back to the early part of the 17th century. It's what Murray Rothbard called a system of statism, using economic fallacy to build up imperial power through monopolies and special privileges. Also sounds very familiar to the economic system of today. Not free market capitalism, but statism. I covered mercantilism, the forgotten grievance of the revolution, in an episode sometime August of 2024. That will also be linked to in the show notes. I do encourage you to check that one out as well. Now, let's get back to Thomas Paine's foreign policy. He said, any submission to or dependence upon Great Britain tends directly to involve this continent in European wars and quarrels, and set us at variance with nations who would otherwise seek our friendship, and against whom we have neither anger nor complaint. And again, going back to George Washington, when he talked about foreign policy, it is our true policy to have no permanent alliances with any part of the foreign world. He understood, and he told the people, like, if we wanted to really kind of secure our hard-fought independence here in his first and second term, you really had to not have those alliances with the foreign world, because then you are basically, as he put it, a slave to their whims. If you have a permanent treaty with some other country or region, then if they do something stupid, you're drawn into it. You can't be independent and free unless you have freedom in foreign policy as well. And Paine is a much earlier version of that in 1776. And then he continued, as Europe is our market for trade, we ought to form no partial connection with any part of it. He said, it is the true interest of America to steer clear of European contentions, which she never can do, while by her dependence on Britain, she is made the make-weight in the scale of British politics. Now, he really grounded all of his arguments in a natural rights view from the Enlightenment and things like that. Now, here from the preface to the first edition, he points out that the cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind. Many circumstances have and will arise which are not local, but universal, and through which the principles of all lovers of mankind are affected, and in the event of which their affections are interested. He continues, with the laying a country desolate with fire and sword, declaring war against the natural rights of all mankind. Because once government sets a precedent to do it to you, they also have a precedent to do it to somebody else, and vice versa. This is declaring war against the natural rights of some people is in essence to Paine a precedent to declare war against anyone and everyone. And he said, and extirpating the defenders thereof from the face of the earth is the concern, extirpating, man, physical removal, I guess, is the concern of every man to whom nature hath given the power of feeling, of which class, go on and on. So basically, everyone should support the natural rights of Americans. And here's some interesting points from Dave Benner, who wrote an awesome book on Thomas Paine as well. Paine, he said, made 7 key arguments throughout common sense, including these: that many traditional rights were naturally bestowed and pre-existed government. That legitimate government, now there's a caveat there, not any old government, only certain types rise to a level of legitimacy. And he said they depend on the consent of the governed, and that governmental establishments were based on contractual relationships between individuals. Again, it starts with the individual. And then he also points out that a free people could withdraw from an illegitimate government. As such, a government ceased to possess the ability to demand compliance in principle. So then the people have to choose to take that stand. And while Paine actually focused much of his writing on essential principles, timeless principles, I also thought it was interesting to point out that he was really a man with a plan. 6 months, here we are, basically 6 months before the Declaration of Independence, he called for a Declaration of Independence. He wrote, "Were a manifesto to be published and dispatched to foreign courts, setting forth the miseries we have endured," our grievances, right? "And the peaceful methods which we have ineffectually used for redress, declaring at the same time that not being able any longer to live happily or safely under the cruel disposition of the British court, we had been driven to the necessity of breaking off all connections with her." So Paine is calling for the Declaration of Independence, and Jefferson certainly took him up on that, Richard Henry Lee as well. At the same time, he said, "assuring all such courts of our peaceable disposition towards them and of our desire of entering into trade with them." Again, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. That's the Jeffersonian approach. But here's Thomas Paine, 1776, 25 years earlier. He said again, "assuring all such courts of our peaceable disposition towards them and of our desire of entering into trade with them, such a memorial would produce more good effects to this continent than if a ship were freighted with petitions to Britain." So literally telling everyone else you want to actually help make them rich and be friends with them and explain why you're leaving the tyrants. is way better than begging tyrants to stop being tyrants. Maybe something to think about there. Now, Paine also put together actually another plan, a bunch of what he called actually hints for a constitution. Before the Articles of Confederation, before the Lee Resolution called for it in June and was passed on July 2nd of 1776, some of the main points. He wanted a continental Congress with a minimum of 390 delegates. Now, if my math isn't too terrible, I went to government-run school, so it probably is. That's like one for every 5,000 or so at the time. I mean, if you really kind of did the math for today, he was actually calling for like a House of Representatives of like 50, 60,000 people, maybe 30, basically a lot. You can't have real representation if it's one for every 750,000. That's absurd. That is not representation at all. So Paine called for this type of a representative system. He also wanted a Congress that would elect a president by ballot, and the presidency would rotate between the various states or colonies. Maybe all the laws, but laws in order to really have an impact would require a 3/5 majority rather than just a bare 1-vote majority. And he called for securing freedom and property to all. And he said, quote, "And above all things, the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience." And he wrapped it up with this really, I'm going to wrap it up with this, I think is really important principle. He said, "But where, some say, is the King of America? There, of course, were some concerned. Well, what are we going to do without a leader? We don't know how to live without that." He said, "I'll tell you, friend, he reigns above and doth not make havoc of mankind like the royal brute of Great Britain." But he continued. He's like, I know people are attached to traditions. We got to kind of roll with how people do things. So he said, "Yet that we may not appear to be defective, even in earthly honors, let a day be solemnly set apart for proclaiming the charter." Basically, a Constitution Day. He actually wanted a Constitution Day to kind of give honor to the system that they had set up. He said, "Let it be brought forth, placed on the divine law, the word of God. Let a crown be placed thereon, by which the world may know that so far as we approve of monarchy, that in America, the law is king." I think Thomas Paine's common sense wasn't just a scathing, relentless attack against unlimited centralized power for 1776 or 76 through 83. I think it's a timeless reminder of the dangers of unchecked government, of arbitrary power, one of those grievances, injuries, and usurpations in the Declaration of Independence, and of course, the importance of liberty, natural rights, and so much more. And this is why we work so hard every single day to keep these principles alive. And there's nothing that helps us reach and teach more and more people more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you want to help us get this message out to more people, please consider joining us today. Our membership program starts out at just $2 a month. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. They're all over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It's all spelled out. Or if you don't want to become a member, or maybe just want to throw in a one-time contribution to support us, you can do that over at, or if you already are one and you want to throw a little bit more our way, very grateful, no pressure, but I'm very grateful for any consideration you give to financially backing our work and helping us push to the next level. A one-time donation over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. and 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. There's also a bunch of free and easy peasy ways to help us spread the word, trigger the algorithms, primarily the mainstream platforms. The more watch time you have on the mainstream video platforms, the more they're going to show us to more people. So are liking, subscribing, getting notifications, reviews on Apple Podcasts and every other podcast platform, basically all the stuff that you can do, sharing, etc., comments in the archive. I really appreciate all of your efforts to support the show and help us reach and teach more people about the Constitution, liberty, the principles of the American Revolution, and so much more. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I hope to see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.